Good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Shawn Davison. I'm the CEO of a company called DV Mobile. We're actually located here in Denver. And we've been building apps clear back since 2008, so not long after iOS came out. Danny Sanchez is going to be assisting me today in doing part of the presentation. And this course, when we signed up for it early this year, we did advanced user experience design for Apple Watch. And we're actually making a subtle but important modification to that practical user experience design for Apple Watch. I'd like to actually get a little bit of context actually about who's here with it, what you've done with Apple Watch today. So who has a watch, first of all? Apple Watch? Okay, good. Actually, that's great. And who's actually attempted or actually built some apps with Apple Watch today? Okay, good. So a subset of that. And has anyone attempted to do 2x watchOS 2? Yep. All right. All right. So I've got a little bit of code that I'm going to share with watchOS 2, and we're gonna cover several kind of different topics in this presentation. We're going to start actually with some context, and I'm not going to go over APIs in detail. We're not going to be doing animate with code or all aspects of UX design. What we're going to focus on is user experience, specifically things that we found that is working, and then identify some things that's not working. And then specifically focus on some tips and techniques for creative animation. When I say creative animation, different than, for instance, Maren had a hands-on session yesterday, which was awesome. I actually was in it for a little bit. So taking, I would say, standard animation is really taking elements such as fields and what have you, and moving them around using the animation capabilities to animate, standard objects. We've actually done some animation, creative animation, meaning essentially free flow animation on the iPhone, and we want to show you, basically share with you our story for taking that into the watch, which happens to be very limited in this regard. So it really comes down to, the practical piece really comes down to innovating within the constraints of the OS. So I'm going to spend just a minute on current state of the union for Apple Watch. Not much time here. There's a lot of media buzz right now. There's a huge launch. Apple's not releasing numbers, so there's a lot of criticism, speculation. Yet, and from my perspective, this is a pretty successful launch for a product, a revolutionary product. Whether it's going to hit the numbers or not, who knows? There was a lot of focus on the watch at WWDC. Anyone managed to get tickets for WWDC this year? Okay. Yeah, it's tough these days. I managed to go this year, but it was like 3 years that I wasn't able to because of the lottery system. So watchOS 1.0, it's been fairly painful. And when I say that, I'll tell you a little story about, we started our app experience last fall. We wanted to be early, so we selected an app, and we're going to actually walk through some of the things that we did in that time frame, and then the lessons learned from it. But the simulator didn't really simulate what we expected, so that was one of the big lessons learned. V2.0 is promising, yet it kind of feels like a 1.0 product. So it is where it is. I expect it's going to continue to improve significantly. So I would compare it kind of like the iPhone in the early stages. We didn't even have an API obviously back then, or a third-party access for the iPhone. The big caveat is the watch is not an iPhone. And this seems obvious, but maybe not in some cases. The reason why is we tend to think, a new device or product comes out, especially the phone products. They've come so far in the last 7 years or so that there's a lot of capabilities. This reminds me, clear back when Steve Jobs was actually introducing the iPhone, and he threw up this picture right before he kind of went through his thing. Threw up this picture, said, "Here it is," and then he said, "This thing is three things. It is a touch iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. A touch iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator." He repeated that 3 times before he actually showed the phone. And so, I'd be interested to know, who in the audience actually was involved back with, the first phone. Okay, so that's pretty interesting to me because the technology's come so far, but it was pretty limited back then. I think back, I came from a telecommunications background, and anyone remember what 300 baud was? Okay, cool. So we went from 300 to 24 was awesome, 96, 14.4. So the bandwidth and ability to actually get data somewhere, that was a huge. It took a long time actually. We've made leaps in this regard. But it's not where some people think it should be, right? We have high expectations. So there's actually a precursor for the watch, right? And the Dick Tracy watch, which kind of set expectations of what this thing should do. And we're not quite there in terms of capabilities. It apparently does two-way video, but it started out with two-way radio. Let me see my notes together. So the key is that it's not a standalone platform. It's actually an extension to your phone in the form of a watch. We created this picture to kind of illustrate the point. Is that they're really tied together today, and with V1X even more. So, or I should say V10 even more so, with 2.0, from an actual usage perspective, you can take the cord off and leave it. But what this means today is if you created an app with 1.0, first of all, you got to install it from the phone, and then you've got to basically have the phone reachable via Bluetooth in order for the app to work. And that's specifically one of the things that's changing in 2.0. So there's a few myths that I want to quickly go through. I found this on the net, and again, there's a couple interesting things about this. Really, the myth is that the watch does everything. It doesn't do everything. The fact that there's a Steve Jobs likeness in this is interesting as well, because this is really the first big device out of Apple since Steve left. I had this myth that I was going to have multiple Apple Watches. I was going to have a Sport and an Edition, and that's not really practical. It just doesn't work. So it's not easy enough for a user to switch and say, "Oh, I'm going to use this watch today," right? So something to keep in mind. So I do my workouts in this. I go to formal attire events with the same watch and the same band. I don't even want to take the time to change the band. So a little different than kind of what my expectations were up front. The other thing about this, though, is the watch, from an Apple marketing perspective, is really focused on a jewel. Its intent is to be essentially a fashion or a jewelry device, a wearable jewelry device. That's the market, essentially, that they're going after. I actually didn't wear a watch for many years. So I've started wearing a watch because this is my business and I like it. Another myth is that we can do what Apple does in the code. There's a pretty significant lag. This is an example of the heartbeat and the sketch capability. I'm curious, anyone actually has done this? One person, two people. Right. By the way, you guys want to come up? I have a awesome little stylus afterwards. Anyone who's participating or anyone who wants to chat afterwards. So I love this concept, but as of to date, it's not being really used yet a whole lot. Frankly, Danny and I attempted to do this in preparation for the event, and Danny was showing me some love because he could actually see my heartbeat, but I couldn't see his. So there was a gap. That may be because I actually had already upgraded my watch to Watch 2.0, so I think there's some regression issues and still bugs and what have you that are working out in that regard. It is also kind of demonstrates that there is going to be some great, let's say, enhanced animation capabilities beyond what we can do today, because this really does appear that it's tied to the heartbeat. As far as I can tell, it's not simulated, which is pretty cool. So, how's the watch? Primary uses for the watch today. Notifications. And actually, Matthew just finished a session, which was great. I'm just focused on notifications, which is good. This notification is probably one of the more annoying ones. I don't know if you guys have experienced it, but the activity overall is actually very useful. But the point is notifications and short glances are the key things. Siri, I think, is going to have a lot of usage over time. It's context sensitive to the watch, and so like this question actually tells you it knows it's on the watch. Passbook, Apple Pay. And then the fact is there's really no third-party app today that's got any dominance. So my point here is that you got kind of a core set of apps and user experience, but no one's really kind of setting the lead in terms of user experience there. I'll just reiterate, this is a painful picture. It's been a little painful from a developer perspective. Okay, so that's kind of a high-level piece of kind of where things are at overall. We're going to drill into some experience and best practices, and then what worked, what didn't, and then show you a little bit of code demo. So, our definition of best practices is doing more of what works and less of what doesn't. So, to do that, I'm going to set some context and introduce Danny here. So we started out last fall and very early, and we wanted to do an Apple Watch app. We wanted it to be on the store when the watch was released, and we did it. But it took a lot of work, and we had a customer that we thought, oh, this is a 5-star app, and it users love it. They love the user experience, and it's very personal. So we thought we'll bring it and figure out how to do the Apple Watch. So Danny, coming up and you can share that experience.
Hi everyone, I'm Danny Sanchez, lead designer for DV Mobile, and I'm going to walk you through a day in the life of an Apple Watch app designer before the watch release. So this is 2014. Just remember that picture of Miley Cyrus. First of all, I want to talk about 3 sections. I broken into sections. The first section is the black screen, and this is just experiences that we bumped into through the development. And this was one of them. this is the app that we talked about. It's a 5-star app, and it's based on the book by Martin Borison called One Moment Meditation, OMM, and it's a meditation app. Technically, it's a very, very simple app. It doesn't do a lot of fancy things, but it's very complicated in subtleties of design, experience. The client is very, very, very focused on the experience because it's a meditation app. It's a lot to do with the experience of meditating with an electronic device. And what it has to do is you meditate for a minute. So the challenge was, how do we take this into that? Back at a time where only thing we had was that mockup. There was no videos, there was no documentation, there was no nothing. And it was all assumptions. It was all, well, it looks like a tiny iPhone in your wrist. So it was just all based on assumptions. And we started doing the obvious things. And what's the first thing that we thought was obvious to do was, let's just take this and put it there. And of course that didn't seem to work very well. That was the first bump in the road, is we have a black screen. That is, the device is designed so that the screen doesn't look like it has edges. But it looks like it just flows out into your wrist. So using color backgrounds that is not black, just not an option. So that just cuts out a lot of possibilities, a lot of creative liberties that you could take. So we did the second obvious thing. Let's just invert it, let's just reverse it. And that didn't seem to work either. Why? Because the client was very specific. He said, he looks like a ghost. Like this character is called the little guy. And he said, the little guy is like the heart of this app. And he looks like a ghost here. So we said, okay, let's do the next obvious thing. We'll make him have color, just like we did in the other app. And now he said, it's too small. His facial expressions are key. You want to see how he breathes, how he closes his eyes. And he's so tiny right there, we cannot really see that. So we did the next obvious thing. Just make a zoom up to the head. And that's kind of where we ended up. Then we bumped into the next problem, which is our little guy had a black outline in a black background. So we did an enormous study of colors, options, things that we could do still back in 2014 based on kind of the colors that Apple had released in the few mockups and screenshots they had at the time using the same colors they were using, all on a black background. And we ended up going for a gray outline. And in the end of the meditation, once you're done with the meditation, the little guy opens his eyes, and this halo appears around his head, this halo of peace and wellness. And there was another challenge, because how do we do that? That has to be like, it's going to look like the edges of the screen there's no way we could do this. There's no other way around. Let's say, okay, if we're going to show color, there's a meaningful moment when we can do that. This is the time where it's okay to do it. The second thing I want to talk about is animation. Oh boy, yes. We all thought it was going to be very exciting, it was going to be very dynamic, it was going to be like, oh yeah, it's going to be great. And as the project went on, it was not so great. So this is a little animated GIF that I made, a mock-up, to show what we wanted to the team, convey it to the client, like this is what we have in mind. And it's using, I think, 5 frames or something like that. It's very limited, just to show the idea. This was the first screen, like a splash screen, to tell the user, hey, you have to tap it to start. And it's made out of these frames. That many frames. So that was fairly easy. That was really, really fast to do, really quick, really easy to test as well. But of course, the entire app is based on the iPhone, on video. It has a minute-long video running at least 24 frames per second. So how are we going to do that here? We have limited size, we have limited time. I started mocking all the little like videos and segments in the least number of frames, and we were dealing with the frame rate. Is it going to work with 16? Is it going to work with 8? Is it going to work with 4? And as it got more complex, it started looking a little bit like this. But like, one moment I realized, well, I'm creating sprites for a 90s video game. Because that's exactly what it is. It's exactly like that. It's an old style animation where you're going back to a flip book. Right? You're making each frame and you just show it really fast so it looks like it moves. The last thing we bumped into was the active time. We didn't know, because the simulator didn't reflect it, that the screen goes dark. So we started thinking, okay, on the iPhone app, we have a timer that tells us when the minute's ending. So users can have an idea of, am I in the middle of a minute? Am I almost done? So we started thinking, oh, again, based on the little mock-ups and screenshots that Apple had released of this activity circle, we were like, oh, we'll just do that. It didn't work. After a few seconds, it went dark. So there was really no point in showing a minute-long animation if the screen goes dark after a few seconds. So what we ended up doing is like, let's just not do that. And we came with a really meaningful thing to do that was, once the screen goes dark and you're during that minute, and if you kind of cheat, and if you go like this, the little guy comes up and he winks at you and says like, hey, you should not be peeking. You should go back to meditating. And it goes dark again. So instead of making this minute-long animation of just watching him breathe, we decided to make this very short but meaningful, like timely animation that shows up in the moment where it matters. And we actually received comments from real people saying that they love this little animation. When they open their eyes to look at the device and they catch the little guy also going like this, go back. So that's what we do it for. It's the moment when you see that, it's like people really appreciate that, all that we went through, because it really matters. So this is the design lessons we learned from this experience. Background and borders are important. I think never before we've had a device that had that constraint of you have a black background. Deal with it. What's on the phone doesn't always translate, which is our first thought was, oh, let's just take what we have in the iPhone, put it on the watch. It doesn't work like that. And limit your animation to, it might not be the obvious thing. You can do a very simple and short, meaningful experience in the correct moment, and you deliver the experience to the user without doing minutes of video or animation. So it can be done, and we learned a lot. So that's all for my part. I'll pass it back to Shawn. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Is that working? Okay. So, as you can tell, it was a pretty, we thought it was the ideal project for Apple Watch. But frankly, it was pretty aggressive. And in retrospect, I don't think I would do that project for the first Apple Watch app if I were to do it again. So we're going to go through a number of things around what works. In particular, Apple Watch is designed very flow-based versus free flow, which has kind of been the design of this app. So the first thing I want to talk about is this myth that your app lives more than 7 seconds. And I've got this timer here just to demonstrate. You see the background. You get phones, right, or iPad, or tablet devices and phones. People are on their device for a long period of time, right? They're looking at their device for minutes, maybe on a desktop for hours. On the watch, it's just seconds. And Apple has emphasized this, yet I didn't really get it until going through the experience that it's so important that you create short interactions. We're going to talk about that. So we look at the 7 seconds in the life of an app. Notifications, including short look and long look, which Matthew did a great presentation just last hour on. A short look, honestly, is usually less than a second in terms of the display time that you see that information. So you lift it up, you see it just for a brief moment. And then long looks usually have some kind of touch or interaction, and so they go off for a period of time. But if you if you don't touch the display, it's going to go dark. And when I say go dark, it's basically the app is being suspended. The suspension on the watch, in my opinion, is death. When I say death, basically you need to treat it as if the app was killed and you're coming back in. So you want to maintain state in that process so that you can restore that state as needed. Glances are kind of in between in my slide here. The reason why is it's really a user action to get there versus information coming to them. So the user will actually swipe up and then look at something briefly and then possibly go into the app and do something. So it's a good way to actually access apps. We found that it's not very practical actually for apps to be accessed from the menu unless it's something that they explicitly want to do, like a workout. So they gotta know specifically what they want to execute on that. So I want to show a couple things. One of the things we found, lessons learned, that's really important between V10 and 210, or V10 and 2.0, is in V10 there's this option called Activate on Wrist Raise. And it gave you a couple of options. On wrist raise, show watch face, and then the second item was resume previous activity. And from a developer perspective, we loved this early on because we would change it to resume previous activity and our app would stay there, right? It's like, oh, our app's still here, right? It didn't go back to the watch. So you could actually continue to interact with the app. The problem with that is that's not the default option. So when a user gets their watch, installs it, never are they going to have that option on by default. And then what we found is that actually in V2.0 it's completely gone. So Apple's not giving you the option to do that now. So what this means is it's even more important that essentially an app, the life of an app is very short if it's based on a notification or a glance. And a user, if they're explicitly going in to do something, it's really about configuring something. I'm going to configure a workout. I'm going to do something that's going to take a very short period of time. The other thing I'm showing on here is actually the storage usage. We've attempted to find correlation between storage usage and install times and load times of apps, and frankly, we haven't got there yet. We've seen install times and load times of apps all over the place. So it can take 5, 10, 15 minutes for an app actually to install on a watch from the phone, which is not a great user experience because when somebody downloads the app on their phone, they want to go check it out as soon as possible. And another thing is when somebody downloads an app, by default they're not actually enabled for the watch. You actually have to go into the watch application and enable it and tell it if there's a glance that you want the glance to be enabled. So that's one thing that we're suggesting, that you're going to want to prompt or prime users in the app. So when they go through their first time user experience on the phone, that it says to enable your app, here's what you need to do to use the watch app. What's happening is a lot of users are installing, when they install their watch for the first time, there's an option to say, install all the apps I have. And so they get all these apps on the watch at that time, but any apps installed after that are not going to be automatically installed. So I just wanted to say, I hope this doesn't come across as whining, because I do believe this is a remarkable platform. It's going to get better. As I said earlier, other technologies have not started this well. by any means, and we've got a lot of capabilities to work with. And I love John and Nicole's theme for the conference, which is be awesome and build awesome things. So I think we can do that. This may be obvious. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's working, but simplicity is extremely important. Keep it very simple. And I don't want to say any more about that. Shorter than short. So Apple actually at WWDC says, 5 seconds is what they suggest for interactions. Don't be doing things that take more than 5 seconds. I'm saying 3 seconds. You want to keep it really short. That's what makes the existing apps work really well. Glances, I would say, are working pretty well. I would call them a favorite or an app bookmark, kind of like a browser bookmark. It's a way to get back to something you use on a frequent basis. And they're a great way for accessing an app. So I've experienced, I run a lot, so I'll go out for a run, and if I start running before I start my workout, I find it very cumbersome to actually go back to the main menu, scroll, find the workout icon, which is really small, touch it. I ended up probably 50% of the time hitting another icon and starting another app. So I have to stop and then do it very carefully. So having a glance is a great way to basically swipe up, touch it, you're in the app, and you're off. So a couple of areas that I suggest that require priming. What I mean by priming is you're going to actually have to essentially train the user on this a little bit. Eventually they'll figure this one out, which is force touch. Force touch is not a feature that we believe is very obvious at this point. In other words, it's optional, and not every app has force touch. And it's actually, there's no visual indicator to tell whether you have force touch capability in the app. So essentially what you're doing is you're experimenting. You're hitting it, pressing hard to find out, is there anything else this thing does? So the way to help with that, and here's an example and another issue, and that is handoff. And actually, I like to ask a question. Does everybody know what handoff is? Okay, some of you. I think I knew what it was kind of from the marketing, but how to actually use it was another thing, and make it effective. But here's a good example of where you actually prompt the user to say, hey, you want to use handoff, which basically allows you to take the application, get them back on the phone where you have a bigger display, and use the app. Essentially, it allows bringing up basically the icon. I didn't put one on here. I should have put the screen on here, but allows you to open up the app associated with this watch app. So you can do the same type of thing with force touch. So either in a tutorial, for instance, the One Moment Meditation app that Danny showed, we actually have a 4-page, very simple tutorial on the first user experience on the watch. It says, here are the things that you can do with it. And that's helped. Just a few things I want to point out. From a user experience perspective, these are two different functions or views. This is actually from the glance. The glance, and this is actually starting the application for weather. But wait time is a killer, right? So you start the weather app, and it doesn't come back in that 7 seconds. Most of my experience with most users is I'm not even going to do that. I don't have time for that, right? So the glance on Starbucks, that's been my experience a lot there. So being able to basically create that glance or that experience such that wait time is not there, and that's not easy today. It takes quite a bit of work to figure that out. This is, I mentioned earlier, that the load time, the actual install time for an app can be significant, up into 10, 20 minutes, and it seems to be somewhat intermittent. Some apps actually fail on installation at times. So there's a fair amount of testing around this, right? So when you're designing and building a watch app, keep in mind that there's a lot of testing to make sure that it's working the way you expect it to work today. Here's another example, and this is an Apple example, but I think it applies to lots of other apps. Size matters, and in this case, I'm showing this image because it's got the little red battery indicator up on top, or at least what I thought it was initially. So I don't know how many of you looked at this and said, "Whoa, I think that's my battery. My battery's going low." Yeah, I see lots of nods. And but really, what it is, and here's a larger version of it. And this one's completely acceptable, right? Is you can tell that it's supposed to be a phone, and so it's the connection to the phone. So you want to be careful about icons that are so small that they're misinterpreted. And in this case, it does look like a battery indicator when it's small. And this is the example if you lose disconnection. OMM at this time still is a 1.0 app, and you won't be able to run it. All right, so we're going to change gears and talk a little bit about creative animation and a little bit of the experience that we've had there and lessons learned. I'm going to talk a little bit about iOS. Actually, I'm running out of time, so we're going to move through this really quick. You had lots of options in iOS for animation. You could do video segments. So you saw some of the animation we did on the phone actually was using segments of video. We found that was most effective. The plus is it's a lot of flexibility. It's easier to maintain. The downside is it does have size implications. On the watch, we basically have what are called image sequences or flip books. And you can bundle those flip books in the app itself so that they're actually loaded on the watch at the time of install, and you can get up to 30 frames per second. Or you can do a dynamic from the phone, which is not recommended, and that causes a lot of, that slows down and has transmit issues. Again, size matters. App startup is also impacted. We're estimating about 50% better in watchOS 2. I was hoping for better, but it is improving there. watchOS 2 is very flow-based today. Lots of containers and groups. You basically manage objects through containers and alignment. And with 2.0, you have insets and spacing capabilities. They have opened up some animation of basic elements. Opacity or alpha, alignment, width and height, background color, and color intent. What's the big one that's not here, obviously, is essentially size and transformation. Transforms. In other words, being able to move an object around on the screen, or in free flow. So the alignment, you can basically move it left, right, up, down, and around. One of the new interfaces that I'm going to demo very quickly is WK Interface Picker. which allows you to take a set of images and include in a picker. And we're going to show a demo. All right, so here's an app that, let's see, I do this sideways here. Basically a demo app, and I'm making this available, and it's at the end of the presentation. There's a reference. It's got a couple of things in it. One, we're actually showing an animation capability. So if we look at the storyboard, we've got a sample animation in here. And basically, with these elements, let me pull this up over here. You can tell it whether the image is going to animate. But in order for you to do that, you specify a duration here and animate on load. Basically, in the code, you have to tell it what the prefix is. So in this case, I've got a set of frames that are in this images folder. And these represent each of the frame steps of my animation. Now, I've chosen to actually do this in a folder outside of the assets. And a lot of the documentation recommends doing it in here. My experience is it's actually easier to manage the images outside of the assets for animation frames. If you have images that have multiple 1x, 2x, or different sets in here, then the assets is great for that. So I'm just going to run this and check it out. So I've got a simulator here running, and as you can see, it does a good smooth job of basically displaying the animation frames. What we've done is I've added a new class. So this right here you can do in 1.0 of watchOS using an image set today. I actually have another page here, and here we're using the new WK interface. And if I touch this and scroll, you can see I'm just doing it very slightly. And then all of a sudden, I have control over it with the touch. So I can essentially animate this with touch now. And I think this is pretty interesting. So I think the next steps for us is we're going to be using this with some interesting alignment variables. See how we can use this animation and make it interactive with the end users.
Or you just going forward and back through stuff you didn't use?
Yeah, so this would just be, so have any of you done a text message from your watch and used some of the animation in those text messages? And if you take your finger and back and forth, it will slide through those. So this is the same concept. Yeah. So I'm just scrolling through this. 2-finger press on the Mac here is simulated. You can see it actually selects the image down below. So you can use it as a picker. In this case, I wouldn't want all of these images in the picker, but it's a great way to very quickly pick something. And then let's come back to the class for that. So it takes a little bit more to do that. Basically define your WK interface picker. And then upon activation, essentially have to set the items. In this case, I've got 179 images. And then you have an interface builder action on what's selected. So that's simple. Now, when I say that's simple, beta 5 is still a little shaky, so it takes some work to actually get there, but I'm happy about where it's going.
Don't get rid of the watch.
They do get alerted on the watch if they're in the watch app. Yeah. So
All 179.
yeah. So that's a plus, especially in 2.0. And the extension is actually running. Well, basically everything ran on the phone before was basically passing commands in 1.0. In 2.0, it's running on the watch. You can still transfer images, but these are actually on the.
I didn't realize they would dump all that.
Yeah. All right. I think we can go back to the presentation. That's it. So, any questions? We're actually right at time. Is there any questions that you have? Yes.
App you guys did for Apple Watch or other customers ask this for?
Yes. It's the demand has not been as much as I would have hoped in terms of, but the way we look at it now is, the way we look at it is we do a new app. We look at essentially Apple Watch as a follow-on feature. It's not a first. It's not a first release feature right now, but at some point it may be. So yeah, we've got other customers that have gone Apple Watch because of this work. So, yes.
The level of effort that you guys put into making this first iteration, do the customer perceive it as being valuable? As in, oh, it's simple, it's a watch, it shouldn't be that hard, right?
That's a great question. Because this was the first one we did, I partnered with a customer. So in other words, we took on some of the cost of that, right? So that helps, but it actually was more cost than I anticipated up front. It was a lot of cost. So it has to be very clear. You have to be very clear up front on the value that you're providing. Client loves the experience. We paid for a lot of that because we were learning the platform at that time. Yes?
Given the thoughts of complications, or any recommendations or anything along the lines for reducing complications?
I've not spent any time on complications yet. So I'm not able to help you there yet. Or time travel. Yes?
I haven't done any watch stuff yet. I've got to deal with either management or in other case, clients. And I've always found it best to help them understand what we're trying to do. And so I'm asking, but I'm assuming that was probably the key first discussion, is to help people understand this is what you're asking for, this is what we're going to get at.
There's an education process. You're absolutely right. If you're, especially in the consulting space, or let's say IT building for your corporate customers, you're going to want to spend some time educating them on what works and what doesn't, right? But keeping it really simple to begin with is extremely important. Is that where you're going with that?
Yeah. An example is we did an augmented reality app years ago with 3GS. It was great, except everybody thinks it's so cool if you're new, but the public doesn't understand what augmented reality is. And that is always going to be.
That's right.
So it's a discussion I keep trying to have. The people who are geeky blow right by that discussion and go, but it's so cool.
Right on. And there is a little of this here. I don't think it's as hard to deal with as augmented reality, though. Cool. Thank you. Anyone else have questions? Come on up.